Yeah, welcome. Lots of new faces here this evening, which is always great to see. So I'll say a few words about our program here, considering many of you are engaging us for the first time this evening. So this is our monthly Living Earth Youth Dialogue program, sponsored by the Living Earth Movement, the Cobb Institute, and the Institute for Postmodern Development of China. So I'll send some links for these different organizations in a bit, so you can check out all the cool work we're doing. But this program in particular is envisioned by John Cobb himself, American theologian and ecological activist who may be here this evening, God willing. But he's done a lot of work sort of cross-culturally, China and US, and has some real communities and many folks he's inspired in both these countries. And with his work and sort of ecological thinking, ecological civilization, as we like to say, yeah, we're really hoping to build bridges between the US, between China, and yeah, see if we can get young people, especially, to connect from these geographically disparate places. But well, these climate issues home close to home for all of us. So
Yeah.
it's fertile soil nonetheless. So that's the vision, anyways. And so each month we have a speaker, a featured speaker from either China or the US, and we typically try and alternate back and forth. So it's well balanced, and yeah, they come to share perspectives on various aspects of our climate situation, share experiences on the sort of work they've done, share ideas for new ways of thinking and living that are better suited to moving towards ecological civilization. So yeah, we invite people and they have some wonderful sharing, and then we take it as sort of springboard for discussion. So there'll be plenty of community conversation and chat this evening, in addition to what Spencer is going to wonderfully serve us with this evening. So yeah, welcome all. Thank you for taking the time out of your Friday night for those of you in the US and Saturday morning for our friends in China. So Spencer, I will turn it over to you at this point. Thank you.
Well, great. Aw. Um, yes. So again, thank you all for coming. Especially thank you to the folks from my local, my super local community. Um, I have my partner here who is, I believe, in the parking lot outside of outside of one of the biggest parties of the year for folks our age, which happens to be put on by the one of our local permaculture organizations, which is quite fitting. So I'll be joining her right after this. Um, oh, she says she's in the garden. That's even more fun. Yeah, so I can say a little bit about me, and then I'll jump into what we're going to be talking about. So I am someone in their mid-20s who lives in the United States state of Maine, in the Northeast, about as north and about as east as you can get. Um, and I am someone who tries to bring together stuff from different sort of areas, like technical spaces, more sciencey spaces. I did a bachelor's a few years ago in math and computer science. And more recently, I did a few years of a master's in math education. And lately, I've been moving into a more philosophical space, a more theological space. And I'm hoping that in the next couple of years, I'm going to be able to start a program, probably a master's, maybe a PhD, to start really building my foundations in this stuff. My philosophical background is a mix of process philosophy, especially Whitehead and Gilles Deleuze, uh, mixed with some mixed with a Christian background. I grew up Catholic, and bits and pieces that I picked up of Buddhism, especially Zen Buddhism. And I can say that I'm very influenced by the meta modern movement, if any of you have heard of that, um, along with the projects being developed by um, Dr. John Vervaeke and his attempts to grapple with what he calls the meaning crisis, and what I am going to mostly refer to tonight as the meta crisis. So that gives us a pretty good spot to jump in, because what I want to be working with is the fact that we have problems in our own lives, in the world, in our global community, that need to be dealt with, that we seem to be having some trouble dealing with. So a perfect example is the ecological crisis at large, and that um, is made up of a whole sphere of problems. And that's a perfect example of a problem that most folks know is serious, and most folks seem to know that it needs to be addressed, but there seems to be trouble getting going in actually like working with any sort of solution making or even exploring solutions properly. Um, it seems to be hard to get it taken seriously on large scales. Other similar problems would be uh, social and economic problems, where there's huge disconnects between people in different socioeconomic backgrounds. People who might have like loads and loads to offer each other, both in terms of like creativity and productivity, and also in terms of companionship. Um, also, uh, division and isolation between uh, folks from different political backgrounds, or folks from different cultures or different nations, which is one reason I'm very happy we're doing this tonight, because uh, the the U.S. and China are very, to my mind, very divided, very almost like there's a wall between us, even though like we're all people and we're all alive, and we all get that it's valuable to care about each other and to connect. And the funny thing about this set of problems that I'm calling the meta crisis, and the reason I'm calling it the meta crisis, is that it's a funny sort of situation where the problem might not even be the challenges we're facing so much as the how hard it is for us to work with those challenges. So I referenced the ecological crisis a minute ago, and I referenced how there's broad recognition that this is something that we need to work with, but humans in general, uh, all over the world, seem to be having a hard time. Although I should say it does sound like you folks in China are having a little bit of an easier time doing seriously engaging with these problems. But in general, I can say that um, we seem to be having trouble jumping in and taking it seriously and trying to do something about it. So in some sense, we might not even have so much of a a problem with the crises themselves as a problem with education, and a problem with getting solutions out to people, getting awareness of what's going on and what folks can do and how much power we all have, so that we can all use that power to actually do something, to realize the uh, the hope that's very much present, that we could easily realize. So what I wanted to do is bring in some lessons that I've learned from my philosophical explorations, especially this book. This book by a philosopher of mathematical physics named Gabriel Coutren. It's called Pleramatica, and its goal is to mix process philosophy with German idealism, especially the philosophies of Schelling and the later Fichte, um, to try to grapple with these problems of disconnection and isolation and maybe we could say apathy that I've been referring to as the meta-crisis, along with what might be the core of the meta-crisis, which is our trouble facing these problems in the first place. So Coutren talks about this as the problem of disligation or disconnection, being unbound or untethered from each other, from life, really, from uh, from action, we could say. And his general proposal for working with this problem, for facing it and working through it, is very simple. It's allowing life to relegate us, to reconnect us, to rebind us, retie us to our lives, these lives that we're actually living, by simply allowing the process of relegation that life is always taking part in, this process of binding life to life by life, allowing this process to play out on its own without us trying to interfere with it or um, uh, isolate ourselves, put ourselves in bubbles where we cut ourselves off from a lot of these challenges, or we cut ourselves off from each other. So he wants to propose a kind of religion that's not a religion, or he said uh, years back when in his doctoral dissertation um, that he'd like a systemic enlargement of the real experience of reality. And the way he wants to do that is by recognizing and reckoning with the the ways that every particular life is constrained so that it's not all of life. So like, for instance, I am just myself, and by being myself, I can only do a certain sort of things, but I can also do all of those things. So I'm in a different sort of spot relative to being alive than anyone else by being me. And in the same way, each of you are in a different sort of spot relative to being alive compared to any of us. And especially working across these large cultural differences, we might have fundamental differences in the way that we relate with the world or the way that we relate with life that might be shared by most of the folks in our own culture, but aren't shared across these cultures. And again, that might mean that we're all limited in sort of ways, but those limitations also afford us certain sort of powers, certain sort of abilities to relate with things and communicate and get a sense of what's going on. So what Katrin would like to do is simply encourage everyone to engage with each other, to collaborate with each other, and reckon with how different each of our experiences are, and how different our experiences are, even just like moment to moment, or one day to the next, 1 year to the next, how much our relationship with life, even on our own, is constantly changing, so that we can start to get a sense of what life is like for all of the different ways that it can be experienced, so that we could start to take advantage of all of the different powers and capacities that we all have, so that we can use those powers and capacities together in um, our being alive together, and importantly, to fight this process of disligation that we seem to be engaged in, that, or maybe that seems to be engaging us, this process of disligation that is bringing us apart and preventing us from collaborating, and preventing us from sharing the capacities and abilities that we all very much have, preventing us from bringing these together to the problems that we need to be working with. So the way that he does that, and this might be the most tricky part to explain, but it might also be the most important part, is that he picks up a cue from the later German idealists, especially Schelling and Fichte, to do a funny conflation, a funny way of mixing categories that we usually keep apart. Categories like um, subject and object, we could say, or experiencer versus the world that we're experiencing. Or we might say um, experience compared to behavior, where we might think of experience as something that's on one side, that just gets to see behavior on the other side. And the German idealists all the way through wanted to question this distinction that they felt was artificial. And they felt it was actually quite obvious that it was artificial, because in a way, a behavior or action can only actually take place if it's experienced. And experience can only have any sort of significance if it happens to behave in a particular sort of way. So it doesn't seem like we actually need to make any sort of distinction between um, uh, action or behavior, or like doing stuff or stuff happening on the one hand, and experiencing that stuff, having a sense of that stuff, uh, living through it from a first person point of view. We don't necessarily need to make that distinction. So he wants to intentionally conflate, intentionally combine uh, the fields, we could say, of all potential experience with the field of all potential action, together with this place, this clearing, we could say, that all of us are experiencing all of this from. Maybe we could think of this as us being ourselves. So he wants to conflate, to mix together this fact of being alive as ourselves with this space of all potential experience and all potential action that he calls the pleroma, or the experiential fields, or he also calls it phenomena, to combine the Kantian categories of noumena and phenomena, but I'm not going to get into that. So as you might be able to tell, a lot of this stuff is a little bit difficult to grapple with. And that's because it's coming from such profound philosophical explorations, the work that's been done in process philosophy, and the work that was done in German idealism and its outcome, which we could call absolute idealism. And on the other hand, we have the language and ways of making sense of things that we use day to day, which don't need to be this fundamental. So what I would like to do is basically try to develop a way of talking about um, this fundamental stuff that Katran is trying to use to help us um, appreciate what we all have by being alive together right now, by framing it in a way that I hope will be slightly easier to make sense of and slightly easier to engage with. And I would like to think um, something. I'd like to think that this way of speaking is concrete enough and approachable enough that it could catch on at larger scales, at least with some critique and some feedback and some development. So I'm just going to check the chat real quick to make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah, cool. So the way I would like to do this, the way that I'd like to develop a language for talking about this stuff is by picking up on a basic bit of mathematical terminology, which is the concept of action in mathematics, where action is when one thing acts on another thing to change it. And you can express this very simply as a function that takes two things and gives one thing back. So it takes the original space that's being acted on, and then whatever's acting on it, and gives back the new space, then the new version of the space that's being acted on. So I like this idea of action because it is pretty universal mathematically. Like we could get into we could get into the Schrodinger equation with like deep quantum theory. We could try to get into quantum field theory, or one of my favorites is the causal set program, which I'll actually be talking about a little bit more in a minute. But what I've found from my own experience diving into these spaces is that we don't need to get very far in any of them to notice that the universal property of all of these different ways of thinking, all of these different theories of fundamental physics, fundamental reality, is that there's always action. There's always stuff changing. And specifically, we could say there's always what's already happened acting on acting on the space of everything that could happen. And I think that's a pretty natural way of thinking for even just in day-to-day life. So like I always go about my life with an understanding that how my life has gone so far will affect how my life keeps going. And in this language, how my life has gone so far and how I've been living so far acts on how my life could go to decide how my life actually goes, so to say. And we can get a little clear about this using using the language of the causal set program, this program in theoretical physics or mathematical physics that's based on what they call causal sets, which are these very simple things that are just made up of relationships between different things, where some things are prior to other things. And that's the only condition, just that some things are prior to other things. And we could say that those things are causes of the other things, and they're causes of their effects, or we could also say that they came before their effects. It doesn't really matter that much. I'll share a couple diagrams in the chat so you can see some of what this looks like. So it's stuff like this, where you can have on the left two things that come after one thing, or you can have one thing that comes after one thing, and then another thing that's unrelated to either. Oh, I'm sorry, I shared it in the wrong spot. There you go. So yeah, you can have something that comes after something else, and you can have something that's unrelated to either of those things, or you can have two things that come after something else, so that they're both related to this first thing. And you can see that on the right, we have another example of this that's slightly more complex, where we have some deeper relationships between these earlier events and these later events. And it doesn't really matter that much what these structures look like, so much as the fact that we can talk about these structures and that these structures can potentially change. So what I'd like to do with these is think of these as kind of like the relationships that we're always immersed in, where there's always stuff that happens that's happened before us, or stuff that happened, stuff that's more basic than other stuff that's simpler than other stuff, really just like any sort of orderings to our life that allow us to make sense of um, all of these different things in some sort of landscape. And I would like to talk about this as the way that we are alive. And what I would like to do with this is think about the ethology of these changing relationships. So ethology is a concept from the biological sciences, from animal studies, where you study the behavior of a certain animal to get a sense of its ethology, its basic ethos, or the ethics that drive its actions, that drive its behaviors, kind of the principles behind its way of living. So we can think of our own, to go from animal studies and the biological sciences to something more close to home. We can think about our personal ethologies as how we live life, how we go about our day, how we get up in the morning, um, our little quirks and ticks, the way that we talk, the way that we think, the way that we connect with people, the the way that we uh, live in the world, and the way that we feel we belong. And we can go a step further than that by thinking of the ethology of all of us together, the ethology of how all of us live life together at the same time, how all of our different ethologies are in relationship with each other. And I think this is helpful as a way of thinking about how all of our ways of living combine to create a certain sort of life for all of us. Because on the personal level, the way that we happen to live might seem kind of arbitrary and simple, and might not seem to affect much. But then as we go on higher and higher scales, like from just this community of ourself on our own, to a community of us and our friends and family, us and folks directly around us, um, folks in our state or our country, all the way up to the global community of everyone on Earth. All of these stages of the ways that we're living together, all of these ethologies add up to decide how we can actually live together, how our the ethology of all of us being alive together can play out. And I like thinking this way because it bridges some themes in what we could call spirituality, where we try to work with and transform our spirit, our way of being alive. It also allows us to tap into what we could call normativity, where we try to get a sense of and try to relate with what is normal, what the norms are in any particular space, or on the other hand, what might be weird in any particular space. And we might even be able to think of different sorts of different ways of looking at the world, or different framings of, we could say, truth, or we could even just say seriousness, as different tendencies in our ethologies, where the ways that we live decide how our thoughts look to us and how our thoughts look to other people who are living different ways. And the ways that all of us are living together decides how um, our, we could say, our global culture looks, how our shared sphere of meaning looks, such that we can coordinate or fail to coordinate around any sort of challenges that we might be facing. Like as I started talking, as I started out talking about the meta crisis, this crisis that is potentially defined by our inability to fully relate with it. Now, what's funny about ethology, what's funny about the way that we live, is that it changes. We're always changing as individuals and as communities and communities of communities, communities of we could go on and on until we get to the top uh, level of everyone on Earth. The way we're all living together, the ethology of all of us living together is always changing. So we could think about a kind of a second order of action. And this is why I really love the causal set program, because this is a basic part of a fundamental part of how causal set theory frames physical reality, which is that it frames all of these different relationships in terms of a process of these relationships changing, where the only way that you get to any sort of setup, any sort of landscape of relationality, is by starting off with one little thing, then adding something else with some sort of relationship to it. So if you look at this diagram that I just shared, you start out with this one little thing at the bottom, and then you either add something else that's unrelated to it on the right, where you have these two dots, or you add something else that comes after it, which is what we have on the left, where we have two dots connected by a line. And you see, um, each time we add something, we have options of how it could be related to other things. So in other words, every time uh, something could potentially happen, it could form a different sort of relationship with all the other things that have happened so far. And we can imagine the space of all the ways that these changes could go from one step to the next. And in the causal set program, this process of building and adding these new ways of relating is fundamentally what creates the structure of space and time, or what we could more concretely call the space of measurement. So things have certain sort of relationships that we can measure because their relationships have been structured along these certain sort of patterns. So in this diagram, again, we can see the whole space of all the ways that things could go. And then we could trace out a particular line, a particular path in blue of a specific way that things are changing. So we can think of this blue line, this blue path, as each of our personal ethologies. And we could think of, or we could equivalently think of it as all of our the ethology of all of us together. And then we could think of the ways that our ways of living on our own and together are changing as this bigger network of all of the different ways things could go. And the funny thing about causal set theory is that what we would call time happens in causal set theory as this space of potential relationships changes. And in the language of Whitehead, we could say that the many are increased by one. The many become one and are increased by one. The many relationships of all the different ways things could happen, or in our case, the many different ways we could live, become one particular way that we live, which then increases, then adds to all the ways that we could potentially live together. And what we get by thinking about this extra level, this changing landscape of our ethologies, this changing landscape of all the ways that we personally live, and all the ways that we live together, and this whole spread of all the different ways that these changing relationships could go, is that it opens up a little bit more space for what we could call hope, possibility, for stuff to happen that we can't expect, because as far as we can tell from how things have happened so far, it doesn't seem like things might go this sort of way. But from this bigger point of view, we can see that how we might expect things to go might only be decided by the particularities of how we're actually living right now, how our ethology actually looks right now for us as individuals, and for us all together. So we can see how these ways of living alone and together could potentially change, go through transformation, on our own or together, once again, such that we have more options, more possibilities, more space to breathe, more ways of being alive together, more ways of connecting with each other. And what I would like to propose is a funny little move, and this is where Katrin comes back in. A funny little move where I want to call this higher order ethology, this space of the changing, that how the changing of the ways that we live behaves, how this way that the ways that we're living behaves, I would like to call ether. And I'd like to call it that because of a particular theory in the causal set program that I won't get too far into, because it's not super relevant. But in this theory, what we would call matter, or equivalently what we might call the fact of our experience, the fact of our first person experience, is identified with this space of changing potentialities, this space of changing relationships, this space of changing behaviors. Because once again, we don't need to draw such a big distinction between behaviors and experiences. And I think, even though this might seem kind of arbitrary, like picking out this word ether and attaching it to this random concept, I think it actually fits pretty well with the way that the word ether has been used in the past. So we could say that this space of potential changing behavior is ethereal because it is fundamentally obscure. It can't possibly show up in any way that we would traditionally consider concrete, because it is the fabric through which any appearance of concreteness would manifest. But what's funny is that it doesn't necessarily get less concrete by being the ground or the soil out of which concreteness grows. It actually gets more concrete. We could say it's ultra concrete. So one way of thinking of this is that we are concretely living our particular lives, but we could say that we are ultra concretely living life, such that even if our particular life were to change or go away, we might not have any reason to assume that life would go away or the living of life would go away. This living of life seems to be fundamentally concrete in a way that the basic concreteness of our particular life, our particular lives, doesn't seem to show. So when we're looking for something ultimate to relate with, something absolute, and this is actually what Gabriel Catren refers to as the absolute. We can turn to this soil out of which all of the particularity concretenesses grow, that is, again, necessarily more concrete than all of them, ultra concrete, universal, beyond any of the particular ways that, to bring it back to ethology, all of the particular ways that we could live, and therefore all of the particular ways that we could disagree, we could at least agree that there is a change in how we look at things, and a change in the way that we relate with the things that we're disagreeing about, such that we can use this fact of change and the potentiality that it contains, the potentiality to become eventually aligned, to become aligned in our worldviews, or in our ways of living, or in our cultures. Without needing any sort of what we might call divinity that is different from the life that we're living. So in this sense, and to come back to Catren's concept of relegation, this is why he proposes that the process of relegation that life is engaged with can work as a kind of religion for us, because this ultra concrete soil from which all of our particular livings are sprouting from is inherently core and essential to anything that we could possibly do, any meaning that we could possibly engage with, or value, or foster. And again, what's funny about this way of thinking of an absolute, or an ground, as Schelling called it, one of the German idealists, is we don't need to propose that this exists. We don't need to convince anyone that this exists. We don't need to convince anyone that that they are alive. So we already have access to connecting around this this foundation, no matter who we're talking to, because everybody can agree that we are alive, and the ways that we're alive are changing, and that those ways that how we're alive are changing is full of potential, full of untapped possibility. And what I would like to propose, and what I would like to talk about tonight, is relating with this this ultra concrete soil from which all of us grew up, using the framework of permaculture. And I love the framework. I love permaculture because what it does is it tries to capture the structures and patterns through which life works, the patterns and structures through which nature works, so that we can find our way into that flow and find our way into taking part in this automatic working of nature, this way that life is always living itself, so that we don't need to fight anything anymore. So that instead of getting caught in the disease of disligation, of being disconnected, and then trying to fight against this disease, trying to disconnect ourselves from this disconnection, which is just going to send us in loops, as it often does send us in loops. Instead of doing that, we can embrace the basic process of self-relegation that life is always engaged in, um, which again is intended to be expressed in the framework of permaculture in the form of a set of 12 principles and 3 ethics that are meant to guide the use of these principles. So I'm going to put a little PDF in the chat. And this one is in English. And here are 2 in Mandarin. And you can go through those in your own time, but the core things that I want to highlight in those is these 12 principles, the 3 ethics, and then the 7 domains in which permaculture can be practiced. So the principles go like this. The first is observe and interact. So observe what's already here and engage with it. Very simple. Second one is catch and store energy. So this could mean energy in the form of food, or energy in the form of sunlight, energy in the form of nutrients in soil, but it could also be energy in the form of excitement, passion, hope, capacity, energy that could fuel future action, energy that could fuel future change. The third principle is obtain a yield. Don't try to be fundamentally selfless about this process of trying to reconnect with things. Because what would happen if you tried to be selfless is that you would forget that you yourself are part of this, that you yourself are part of life. So you yourself are going to need some of the fruits of your labor. The fourth principle is apply self-regulation and accept feedback. So recognize the constraints of what you're working with, and keep yourself bound to those constraints and ensure that you stay bound to them, and allow those around you to guide you into fitting into those constraints. The fifth principle is use and value renewable resources and services. So shifting focus from anything that we could use just once or just a few times to things that we could keep using, that we could keep coming back to again and again indefinitely, such that if, for instance, we get joy or meaning from this resource, this service, this process, we can rely on it and we don't have to worry about it disappearing on us. Sixth principle is produce no waste. don't expect that any externalities that you're producing, like uh, toxic waste or microplastics, for examples, um, are just going to be taken care of by the environment. Because if you're fundamentally part of this life that you're calling the environment, then you're going to be affected by those waste products too. It might not be right away, but it's going to be some at some point down the line. And we might also think of this as um, in political fights. Um, we could think of uh, folks on the other side, folks that we disagree with, as kind of like waste products. Like we can just forget about them and throw them away and move on because we've already got what we need over here. But then we're just going to push that off, push whatever tendencies or um, patterns that we're worried about in that other group. We're just going to push that off into the world for it to keep causing whatever we're worried about it causing, just the same, without us being able to do anything to help. The seventh principle is design from patterns to details. So start at the big picture and explicitly the big picture so that you can get a sense of all the stuff that's going on, and in terms of ether, get a sense of all the ways that we can live together, and design from those big scale patterns down to the details of how we actually want to live together, how we actually want to change how we're all living together. The ninth principle is integrate rather than segregate. And again, I could use a political example where you might try to segregate yourself from folks who have political beliefs that you don't agree with. But maybe it might be much more helpful to integrate yourself with not just your own community, but these other communities of folks that you don't agree with, such that you can learn from them and they can learn from you. The ninth principle is use small and slow solutions. So, as an example, this uh, this framework that I'm proposing, ether permaculture, is not a quick solution by any means. It gives us is just a slightly shifted way of relating with ourselves and relating with life, in the hopes that that might eventually accumulate into large scale, meaningful, necessary change. And the advantage of doing that is that then we're not putting too many eggs in one basket. We're not relying on any particular project to get us all the way. So in this case, maybe this shift in perspective is very helpful, but it only gets us to the door for working with other kinds of solutions. The 10th principle is use and value diversity. So appreciate as I was talking about when I was talking about this book, Dharmatica, we want to embrace the differences in how all of us are living and all of the limitations that might create for some of us, and all of the capacities that might create in those same folks. And I should say here, not just folks, also the animals around us and the plants around us. The 11th principle is use edges and value the marginal. So in a permaculture mindset, most of what happens on the edges, because what happens in the center has mostly already been established. And if it keeps growing, then it's what's growing in the center is mostly what's already been planted. We want to focus on where things have just been planted, or where we can plant things, where things are ready to be planted, so that we can allow the center to keep growing on its own, while we are cultivating each of these new spaces where stuff could start growing in new ways that it might not have. The 12th and final principle is creatively use and respond to change. So not just respond to change, but use change, take advantage of change, take advantage of the fact that everything is in flux, and we don't have the kind of anchors or the kind of permanence of, at least in terms of structures or systems, that we might like. But that lack of permanence also gives us some flexibility to change things as those structures are starting to um, create space for new solutions. And we want to, in the permaculture framework, we want to think about these principles in terms of three ethics, which are very simple. The first is earth care, caring for the earth, caring for the land, caring for the soil from which we grew. And in the case of the framework that we've been using so far, maybe we could think of this as caring for the parts of ether that have already taken place, that we want to protect and celebrate. The second ethic is people care, care for the people around us, and the needs of the people around us, the needs for respect and love and meaning of the people around us. And in terms of the framework we've been using, we might be able to think of this as how how ether is actively changing, what's on the verge of happening, how we're on the verge of being alive, how we're on the verge of living. The third principle is fair share, where we want to respect the boundaries of what we're working with in a way that will be fair both to all of those around us, all those humans and all those animals and plants, but also fair to future generations, fair to indefinitely many future generations of people, of animals, of plants. So in terms of the framework of ether permaculture, we might think of this as what's continuing to happen, or the space of the ongoing happenings indefinitely off into the future. And we can think of this in terms of 7 domains, which I'm not going to go too far into, but I think it helps give a flavor of what kind of work has already been done in the permaculture space. So the most basic domain of permaculture is health and spiritual well-being. And I didn't realize this when I started engaging in permaculture, because I figured that it was like a gardening practice, or it's about like growing food and that's it. But actually it's fundamentally about what I've been talking about. It's fundamentally about working with this fabric of how we live day to day, and how we live in a global and existential sense. And for these next few, I'm just going to quickly go through them. The the other the second domain is finances and economics. So again, we haven't even got into to gardening or growing food cultivation. Third one, land tenure, community governance. This is starting to get a little more naturey, but again, fundamentally about community management, about people care, as a necessary process that we need to be embracing and honoring. Land and nature stewardship. Building, so architecture and construction. Then tools and technology. So thinking about applying the permaculture principles and ethics to our tools and our technology. And finally, education and culture, applying the principles and ethics of permaculture to how we pass on our culture and our ways of living and our wisdom, and how we want to live together, how we want to uh, dress our life in art and dance and song and love. So I'll quickly go through a few examples, but that's really about it. I said at the beginning that there's um, not necessarily that much to this. It's supposed to be, again, modeled off of the basic way that life works. So it's not supposed to be anything new, so to say. It's supposed to be what is already here and what's always already been here since the beginning of time. So a few examples of what this might look like is attempting to foster collaboration across large divides. So what we're doing here. Cultivating common ground. Trying to find a shared space of meaning, shared space of agreement between differing worldviews or differing cultures. Developing ways out of our existential challenges. It's a form of permaculture. Working with the reality of the challenges that we face, not just as something that forms an obstacle to the life we're living, but as something that's a basic part of the life we're living. And in that sense, another example is what the philosopher Alexander Bard calls protopianism, where we engage in projects that might be considered utopian because they're so future oriented, but we work directly with what we already have, with what we already know is possible and what we already know is valuable. And to close this off, we can notice that the development and cultivation and spreading of permaculture itself happens to be a form of permaculture. And the development of this framework that I'm trying to propose, the ether permaculture, is again a form of permaculture, because all I'm trying to do is embrace ways of thinking and ways of speaking that have already been established and use them in a slightly new way. And finally, last example of permaculture is seeking feedback, critique, and guidance on this process. So whatever you can offer to me and to all of us would be amazing for me and all of us going forward. So thank you very much for listening and at least attempting to follow along. So now let's jump into talking about some of this.
Wow, Spencer, thanks so much for such a rich and diverse exploration here. Definitely very stimulating, both mentally and spiritually. So that's always a good combo. Yeah, so we have a little bit of time left here with one another this evening. We can go till half past the hour, so about 25 minutes. And yeah, this is a time to ask any questions, share any insights or ideas that Spencer's presentation brought up, inspired in you, make connections. So yeah, I'll start us off, but feel free to raise your virtual hand or put a comment in the chat if you can't be on video or wouldn't like to be, and I'd be happy to read it off for you. So, a very inspirational vision you've brought us. And one with modest aspirations, tuning back into the ether, this life and these basic processes that we are already a part of. I it's relieving to hear things presented that way in terms of how to deal with a meta crisis, a climate catastrophe. Just get back to what we are actually already a part of. But also in practice can be very difficult. So I'd be curious to hear what you think are maybe the biggest obstacles, one or if there's multiple things, since these are all very intersecting and intertwined sorts of systems we find ourselves in. Yeah, what does make this easy, natural process ultimately hard in our current context?
Well, if I might appreciate if other folks jumped in and attempted to answer that too, because it it's a hard question. But I think we can say that one thing that causes this to be so difficult is that somehow it seems to be common for folks to think that people who are living other lives, so basically other people, are a different sort of thing. So, in other words, there seems to be a common belief that someone who is living a different life from you is something completely different from you. Maybe they're the same species, maybe they're like also a person, but what it actually means that they're also a person seems sort of vague and fuzzy, even though what it is to be a person is so obvious to you.
Hmm. Hmm. Any thoughts from anyone else? Yeah, let's get relegated and make these natural connections. All right, Charles, I'm gonna pick on you since no one's taken the stand here. You've been working sort of ecological consciousness stuff for a long time, so I'm guessing you have some firsthand experience about what can be hard about yeah, reattuning to yeah, natural ways of relating. Any wisdom to share?
Well, I'm going to have to set up a GoFundMe campaign for the coaching and the mentoring to process and discern how best to share and bless and practice the wisdom, Spencer, that you have provided in such a stimulating way. I was a little under the weather, wasn't really sure that I could make it here, but I'm so grateful that I did. I've shared a couple of links. I mentioned early on the Midwest Permaculture Institute. They have some resources that I believe you may find valuable. I guarantee they will find what you're sharing very insightful and helpful, as will Dr. Tamsin Willie Barker, an
Mm,
evolutionary anthropologist who founded the Borrego Institute for Living Design, doing a lot of similar work that will benefit. I've been chatting with her about ethology. You know, she's already on fire and interested in learning, connecting with you more. So thanks for asking for any feedback because that's what this sharing from the heart is about. And if it's okay with Jared, I'm going to share a link as well about a little Living Earth guide that Living Earth Movement helped produce for
Ooh.
Earth Day with Earthisms motivated or inspired by John B. Cobb Jr., who, founded the Living Earth Movement as a little 9-minute video that shares his 99 days of legacy leaving work. We tried to get a hold of him. He wasn't available to be here tonight, but I'll make sure he watches the recording because he too is going to be. Oh, so I see that Sandra Lynn has her hand up. So I'm going to just say thank you, and thank you to you for your leadership of this program.
Thank you, Spencer. Just paradigm breaking as usual. Now, the second permaculture principle, was that capturing energy?
Yeah, capture and store energy.
That to me seemed so, I mean, that one principle, so incredibly revolutionary, so many potentialities. It's just, I'm still thinking about it. I almost couldn't listen to anything after that because gave
Yeah,
me
and
so much to ponder the potentiality of that concept and what it could do in the world, to capture and store energy. For one thing, it means we can do things. We can make change.
yeah,
We can capture and store our own energy and bring change.
yeah. And just as a quick example of how permaculture practitioners sometimes apply this principle,
Mhm.
is they try to capture and store energy that would otherwise just go purely to waste. So they might use the heat from the sun to heat up water, or they might use well, actually, I can't think of another example in this moment, but
Composting, food scraps, as
yes,
fertilizer.
precisely, yeah.
Yeah, definitely a deep principle, for sure. I mean, especially if we are broadening our understanding of energy beyond just electricity or these, yeah, very certainly they are particular forms of energy, but they're kind of the dominant way we've come to think about this in our modern technological
Mhm.
society. But yeah, even like community conversation like this is a way to capture and store
Yes.
energy in a sort of social informational mode. But yeah, there's like a lot of energy that can come from one particular ideas that then kind of open new ways of seeing and then acting in situations that wouldn't have been available. But also on an even more basic level, just the way that sort of meaningful community interaction and the care and belonging that comes from that. Boy, can that be like energizing and yeah, offer all sorts of kind of protective benefits to us. So yeah, I think there's really broad ways of thinking about this, especially in the context of the kind of philosophy metaphysics you're outlining that yeah, it makes so many more possibilities beyond just okay, like can I put a wind turbine somewhere and get the electricity in my battery? Which I think it'd be very easy for us to keep thinking that way with yeah, just all the momentum we've had with thinking that kind of technological way about energy. But it's broader, deeper than that. So.
Yeah, and I noticed in the chat, um, uh, Trevor asked a question about this more metaphysical side. He has two questions, so I'll start with the first one. Does the mind really have a life of its own, quite apart from matter? And this is maybe like the way that we've been set up to think, at least here in the US, we could say here in the West, but maybe all over the world at this point, where we think of the mind as something that's like completely separate from the material world. And the what I think is an innovation of thinking in terms of ether that I didn't highlight as much, but I am quite fond of, is that we can think of ether as the matter of the physical world and the matter of the mind at the same time. Because to me, the defining feature of the mind is that it thinks. And thinking is a kind of behavior. That might sound a little bit reductive, but the key here is that I want to reduce things to sufficient enough point that we can appreciate the differences. Let me say that differently. I want to reduce things to just the right point where we can see how things are actually playing out, such that we're not caught up in more superficial differences that might cause us to like categorize this as like one sort of thing, like this is a mind behavior, whereas this is a matter behavior. And we don't know how mind behavior relates to matter behavior because they seem to be completely disconnected, but maybe they aren't disconnected at all. And I think in this way of thinking, we don't even need to hypothesize that they might be connected. We can just say that they are both behavior. And then the second question was, are the principles that I've delineated, are these not tantamount to Kant's categorical imperatives? And that's a great question, especially because the categorical imperatives have, it puts ethics and morality in a tricky spot that is quite, at least to me, difficult to engage with and difficult to honor. And that might be the thing that I'm most concerned about. And I think, yeah, Trevor, you might actually, you might have a great point there. I think they are, these principles of permaculture might be exactly like Kant's categorical imperative. And I might actually say that that's fine, because I don't have that many problems with Kant. I think the problems with Kant are fairly specific in the way that he separates phenomena from the noumena in ways that they might not necessarily need to be separated, which is why Gabriel Catran talks about phenomena. And once you make those small shifts, I think that the categorical imperative reshapes itself in a way that's easier to relate with and easier to honor. That might look something like the principles of permaculture.